So welcome everyone, and thanks for joining us. For those people who I haven't met, I'm Larry Treese. I'm currently working as the medical advisor at Sport Integrity Australia, and I'm delighted tonight to join with Susan White, who's the chair of ASMAC, the Australian Sports Drug Medical Advisory Committee, to bring you a targeted webinar specifically focused on you, our medical colleagues, to discuss the 2022 World Anti-Doping Code changes to the in-competition status of injectable glucocorticoids. As we start, I'd like to acknowledge the Ngunnawal people, who are the traditional custodians of the land on which I'm presenting from tonight, and pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and future. I also extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders peoples that are joining us today. A couple of housekeeping items to start with. We are expecting a lot of people. We're really surprised. We've got 90 online already and over 150 have expressed an interest. So if we could predominantly have your mic turned off and your video off, that'll help people who are short on bandwidth. And we'll be using the chat for discussion. So if you pop some questions in there as we go along, if we haven't answered them along the way, then we'll certainly be happy to discuss points of interest and your questions as we get to the end. So hopefully you're all here tonight because you're aware that in 2021, there was a major revision of the World Anti-Doping Code. And as part of that, it was announced that there would be a change to the S9 category of glucocorticoids, and that they would now be prohibited via all injectable routes of administration during the in-competition period. However, unlike all the other changes in the 2021 code, this change was delayed by 12 months to start on the 1st of January next year, specifically to allow a period of time for athletes and medical personnel to develop a better understanding of the practical implications of this for treatment and management of conditions, and specifically of washout periods. So we're all speaking the same language tonight. As part of the change, also in the 2021 code, the definition of in-competition for the majority of sports has become from 11:59 p.m. the night before an athlete is scheduled to compete until the end of the sample collection period for that competition. And sample collection obviously refers to the anti-doping or doping process. It's important to recognise that some sports have their own definition, like equestrian, and so it's important to check with the athletes you're working with exactly what in-competition means for them in their sport. The other part of the change is about injectable routes of administration. And obviously it seems quite logical if you put a needle on the end as part of your administration, that probably means it's injectable, but these are all the different routes of administration that we're talking about when we refer to this change. Obviously, medical practice is very varied around the world and varied between sports, and glucocorticoids have certainly had a lot of media over the last few years. And while certain sports will have additional requirements above those published in the starting in the 2022 code period. And these changes have been greeted by different countries around the world with different emotions. Obviously, for some, it's a big change in practice, and for others, there'll be barely no difference. What do we know about glucocorticoid use in competition? So this is a study from the Rio Games in 2016, where the International Olympic Committee requires that doctors administering injections do a needle use declaration. Glucocorticoids in 2016 accounted for about a fifth of the injectable substances during the Games, and roughly 2/3 of those were glucocorticoid injections with additional substances, which we assume would be local anaesthetic. Important to note that in 2016, the competition period was actually the whole of the Games campaign. So for this to be an in-competition glucocorticoid injection, it might have been given actually 2 weeks before the athlete competed. And so the definition's changed, and we'd expect this to be lower under the new definition. We also have a good insight into, as Australian sports medicine physicians, how we use glucocorticoids, thanks to the paper by David Hughes, the AIS, and some esteemed anti-doping colleagues. We know that the most common substance that's injected by Australian sports physicians is betamethasone, but there's also a proportion using triamcinolone and dexamethasone. In the graph you can see on the right, you can see most of our injections are used for intra-articular and soft tissue pathologies, with intramuscular use making up only about 10%. What are the potential performance effects of glucocorticoids? There's a key paper that was published by a number of wider stakeholders in BJSM in 2020 that I'd be very happy to, I'll send a link in the chat at the end of the talk to allow people to read it themselves. But I'll quote directly in saying, the complexity of the central and peripheral response after glucocorticoid administration makes the exact causal effects of performance enhancement difficult to identify. But the paper does suggest pharmacological potential for euphoria and reduced perception of fatigue, inhibition of the hypothalamic pituitary axis, increased energy mobilization, and reduced inflammation. And the paper goes on to say it's the concept of potential performance enhancement as the basis for defining the status of the drugs, these particular drugs, on the prohibited list. Also from this paper is this diagram, which is quite complex, and I'll step you through it. Across the bottom are all the different types of glucocorticoids, and across the top in categories of the different routes of administration. For each different glucocorticoid and route of administration, there's a blue box which represents the therapeutic dose range. Across the different options, there's also a red line, and this represents the potential performance enhancement dose. And you can see there's really two halves to the picture or to the table. On the left-hand side, the red potential performance enhancing dose intersects the blue therapeutic dose. So in intravenous, intra-articular, other parenteral and oral, consistently there's a crossover between the therapeutic dose range and the potential performance enhancing range. And this has led to the change in the code for 2022 to align intra-articular injections with intravenous and oral administration of glucocorticoids, given they have a similar potential performance enhancing effect within the therapeutic dose. You can see that's quite different to the right-hand side of the table, where you have inhaled, intranasal and dermal routes of administration, where the potential performance enhancing dose sits far above the therapeutic dose range. This is a paper that was published last year in JBJS Reviews. I don't think the science is that simple, but one of the key messages from this paper was, given we mostly use corticosteroids or glucocorticoids to reduce or mediate inflammation, that this is a process that requires change at the cellular level. And therefore, clinical effects typically and predominantly take up a long period of time. This is reinforced by other wider documents. So this screenshot taken from the anaphylaxis guidelines, looking at the use of systemic glucocorticoids in anaphylaxis, really only does recognised for having a role for prevention of the biphasic component of the reaction, where stated onset of action taking several hours or more. Also from this same paper from 2020, two important facts that WADA have released as part of their education and change to the code. We'll focus on the bottom half of the table first, which represents the different watch out periods for the different routes of administration of different glucocorticoids. This is not something that's been published before, and certainly not specifically related to anti-doping medicine. And so this hopefully will have some valuable information for you, not only about the injection of glucocorticoids in and around competition, but also suggested washout periods for different oral or intramuscular glucocorticoids. The top half of the table represents the different reporting levels in nanograms per mil of the different glucocorticoids. And this is important because the reporting level represents at what point does the lab report to the anti-doping organisation that the glucocorticoids been found at a level that should or could result in an adverse analytical finding or a positive test. And there's been some changes to these reporting levels as part of this change in the 2022 code. So for triamcinolone, the reporting level's been reduced. So athletes are more likely to have a level above because it's a lower level, and therefore be reported as having an adverse analytical finding. For other glucocorticoids, such as betamethasone or dexamethasone, prednisolone, their reporting level's been increased. And so that means they're less likely to be above the reporting level, less likely to be reported as an adverse analytical finding. So as part of these washouts, I'm just draw your attention a different way of representing this information, and we'll focus on the intra-articular components or glucocorticoids that we use in our clinical practice. So for triamcinolone, WADA suggested a 10-day washout period for a local injection. And we'd share with you that our asthmatic experience is that sometimes we've seen results up to 6 weeks above the threshold level at 6 weeks post-injection. The other intra-articular glucocorticoids of interest are those delivered via local injection, and they have a 3-day washout before the start of competition. So how will we manage this process with you in the granting of TUEs? So we've got 2 ways of thinking about this. Either the plan is to use an injectable glucocorticoid in competition, and this will require a therapeutic use exemption. Just like all therapeutic use exemptions, we stratify how they're required on the basis of the level of the athlete. So higher level or elite athletes will require an in advance TUE, and lower level athletes will need to prepare a medical file for a planned retroactive TUE. If you're unsure where your athlete sits, there's a specific list on the Sport Integrity Australia website that will allow you to determine which of these 2 paths your athlete might fit under, and therefore what sort of TUE you might be planning to apply for. So if we're thinking about granting a TUE, what are the components that the TUE committee need to assess or consider as part of granting that? There's 4 components, and they're represented under 4.2 of the International Standard for TUEs. The first is that there's a diagnosed medical condition, and that diagnosis is supported by relevant clinical evidence. The second is that the use of the prohibited substance will not produce performance enhancement beyond restoration of the athlete's normal state of health. And the third is that the prohibited substance is actually indicated for the treatment of that particular medical condition, and that there's either no reasonable permitted therapeutic alternative, or that therapeutic alternatives have been considered and excluded for various clinical reasons. The fourth part of granting a TUE is not so relevant to this particular class of medications, so we'll skip past that. So as a TUE committee, when we're considering applications for the use of injectable glucocorticoids in competition or used during the washout period, we're really conducting a balancing act. We're considering what was the desired therapeutic effect for the condition, what was the potential performance enhancement of the glucocorticoid at the time that it was injected, and was it injected in competition or out of competition? And so they're the things we'll be considering in assessing TUEs. On the other side of this particular figure, so for glucocorticoids injected during the washout period, we advise all athletes, regardless of the level at which they compete, that they need to prepare a medical file. And should they have an adverse analytical finding, so should they have a test and should their test result be above the threshold level, at that point, they should then submit a therapeutic use exemption, including the prepared medical evidence for a TUE. And there's a new part of the code that allows this under the ISTUE, which is 4.1E. Apply retroactively for out of competition use with an in competition adverse analytical finding. So when we say prepare a medical record, what do we mean? I think the classic analogy here is show your workings from Year 8 maths. So the ASMAC committee of sport and exercise physicians need to be able to look at the evidence that's provided and come to a clinical diagnosis and establish that the treatment that is applied for in the form of a therapeutic use exemption is an appropriate treatment for that clinical diagnosis, or is a recognised treatment, actually is the right term. So we're looking for history and examination findings, imaging reports, the fact that alternatives have been considered and included, tried or excluded, and for what reasons. And obviously, if there's any image-guided injection reports, particularly listing the glucocorticoid that was used, they'd be very helpful. In the example of a TUE application being submitted, in addition to this, we need a typed clinical letter and a signed application form by both the doctor and the athlete. So what supporting resources have been developed beyond this webinar tonight? There's a whole new page on the Sport Integrity Australia website. Under therapeutic use exemptions, you'll see on the left-hand side, glucocorticoid injections, new rules in 2022. And you may have found the link to this webinar there. There's also some great 1- and 2-page information pamphlets for doctors. If you scroll to the bottom, you'll find the pamphlet you can see here on the right-hand side, which is one that's targeted more at athletes. And there's a single page and there's a double page. So they'll be very handy resources for your athletes. You'll also find a recording of this presentation on the same part of the website in the coming days. WADA are also currently producing more guidance and resources in this area. And this week released the Glucocorticoids and therapeutic use exemptions paper. In addition to this, in early November, we're promised some checklists for different medical conditions for which glucocorticoids may be used, and also some guidelines for TUE committees about how to evaluate TUE requests, which are also really helpful for physicians applying for TUEs. So now I'd like to hand over to Susan to present some case studies, which we hope will demonstrate some of the information we've provided and help to provide some real-world case examples. So Susan, thanks so much.
Thanks, Larry, for the explanation. And also, I know a lot of you on the call and have been involved in applying for TUEs in the past, but just to say that if this is perhaps your first exposure, that the process for assessing TUEs and applying for TUEs is the same, whatever the substance it is that you're applying for. So we're talking particularly about glucocorticoids tonight, but any other substance that you may end up applying for, we go through the same process of what we need to consider and what the criteria are. So these criteria aren't specific to glucocorticoids. This is how every application is assessed. So we've got a few cases, and before I start, I think it's important to say that the role of the TUE committee isn't to dictate medical practice, but it's to apply the criteria to determine if the application, the situation meets those criteria. When we're not there to place value judgment on how you practice medicine, but it will need to be considered as sort of an acceptable approach to that problem in our Australian environment. And I'm also involved in WADA, and when we do look at international applications, we do try and consider what the local environment is, because there's different practices in different parts of the world. And we've had a meeting recently, and one of the things that certainly a number of countries, including in Australia, we were able to say that this change is going to be potentially hugely difficult in countries like the US, where they tend to inject more frequently than we do. And this was held up in the study that Dave Hughes did. But what it also confirmed in that study was that Australian sports physicians and sports doctors do inject, but they don't inject as often, and they do use intra-articular targeted injections. And given that fact, we actually have felt, although I know everyone's quite nervous about this change, that in fact it really won't impact overly on you or your athletes, except in some small circumstances. So I suppose the main thing is don't be overly worried. It's not going to change what you do if you are practicing sort of good medicine in I suppose, an Australian way, I would suppose, around how we manage musculoskeletal conditions. But we're going to give you 3 case studies. They're all slightly different, and trying to highlight the things that we would look at and the things that we would be cautious or concerned about. So case 1 is an elite netball player playing, as they did last season, 2 games a week because of a condensed season and lovely COVID, who had an acute facet joint injury. An MRI demonstrated an acute effusion in one of the facet joints, and the athlete had failed to respond adequately to oral anti-inflammatories and some physiotherapy. was decided that a CT-guided glucocorticoid injection into that facet joint would be performed immediately following one game to allow sort of the 3 to 4 days break before the next game, to give them sort of maximum time for the injection to become effective. So if you are in this situation and you've decided on this treatment plan, what should be the considerations? Well, let's see one pop up. Firstly, we know the rules are a little bit tricky about in competition, and you do need to check. But for most of the weekly competitions in Australia, in competition is literally, as Larry defined, which is 11:59 before the night before the game. For some tournaments, and so example, World Cup for netball, which Larry and I looked up today, in competition for the last World Cup was actually the whole way through the tournament. And in some situations, in a tournament environment, in competition can be the whole time through, but you have to check that. But certainly for most of the weekly competitions in Australia, in competition is just essentially on game day, which makes things a bit easier. So by definition, this injection, if given after a game, is out of competition. The consideration in terms of the type of glucocorticoid used because of the washout period. So betamethasone has a fairly quick washout period. However, so the washout period is about 3 days. However, the game is in 3 to 4 days. So this athlete, if they were tested, are likely to have a positive test. Also, in my experience, looking at the results of doping tests in competition, that a spinal facet joint injection seems to have a slower washout than a peripheral joint. Don't really understand the mechanics. That's really anecdotal. So if I had to put money on it, I would say if this athlete was tested, they may well test positive. The only thing that I would say is that they're increasing the threshold for betamethasone to 60, and it was 30. So if we look at the washouts, it's possible. It's also possible this athlete won't. With the 30 limit, which occurs up until the end of this year, they definitely would. With the 60, they may not. But everyone's a little different. For that reason, if you're the doctor doing this, you really should make sure you've got a good medical file that you can put together to apply for a TUE should the athlete be tested. So if the athlete gets tested, there's an adverse finding and the athlete's told that they can apply for a TUE. So you would fill in your part, the athlete fills in their part, signs it, submits the background to the case, and then as a TUE committee, how do we look at it? Well, the first thing to realise is that the Australian TUE committee is a little different than many others internationally because it is all sports physicians and they are your peers, and we all mostly know each other and continue to practice together. Unfortunately, some of the TUE committees around the world can be a little bit more unpredictable because they're not all clinical sports physicians. So the only warning I would say is if you're in an international situation, I would have a very detailed medical file until we can see where the benchmark is sitting for some of the international cases. Because what we're giving you today is how we're going to interpret it in Australia. So the way, if we saw this case, it is out of competition use for a documented, and I'll put in brackets, inflammatory medical condition, in that it's not an inflammatory arthropathy, but there is acute inflammation demonstrated on the MRI and clinical signs. I'm telling you, I've seen the letter, clinical signs in the letter that describes the history and examination of this athlete. So the things that, as Larry said, the 4 criteria, it's a diagnosed medical condition with some good clinical evidence, and the treatment that the doctor has chosen is a recognised treatment for this condition. On the balance of probability, would it produce any additional performance enhancement? As the injection's been given 3 days before and it would mostly be washed out, there's unlikely to be a high level It might be over the limit for detection, but it's unlikely to be particularly high. Therefore, we wouldn't be concerned about any potential performance enhancement. And there was some consideration of permitted alternatives, because in the letter the doctor said that the athlete had had some physiotherapy and anti-inflammatory medication, and that this was the next choice as that was not working. So in this case, we would grant this. This is a TUE we would grant fairly comfortably. So next one, taekwondo athlete, persisting non-specific lower back pain without radiculopathy, concurrent low-grade degenerative knee and ankle, and no recent imaging, occasional anti-inflammatory use, and they have a major competition a week away. The doctor has chosen to use an IM glucocorticoid injection for their musculoskeletal pain, non-specific musculoskeletal pain, and they've chosen triamcinolone. Now, I would suggest we don't see this very often. I'm not saying it doesn't happen. I'd certainly be interested to hear from the audience if it does. This is something that we are aware is more likely to happen, as I said, in the US and sometimes in the UK, actually, although they use their IM triamcinolone for hay fever. It is very long-acting when it's given IM and can achieve quite sustained high doses for a long time. So this is technically out of competition, but well and truly in the washout period. The washout period that WADA has given us for IM triamcinolone, 60 days. So yes, the considerations are it is out of competition. Waiting. It is triamcinolone, so it's long-acting. And if this athlete's tested in a week, they will have an in-competition positive. So definitely prepare a medical file. So the TUE committee, well, our TUE committee assessing this, the first criteria, and the thing I would say about when we're assessing TUEs is that as doctors, we all like to balance, look at balance of risks, look at balance of benefit. But the TUE criteria and the code is written by lawyers, not by doctors. And in the world of lawyers and WADA, each criteria has to be met. And if each criteria is not met, then the TUE can't be granted. So you can't, as much as we like to balance, and that's how we practice medicine in general, when we look at the TUE criteria, every criteria has to be met. So the first criteria in this case is there a diagnosed medical condition supported by relevant clinical evidence? And if that's all you got, and maybe you might have gotten a little bit more in the letter, but at this stage, it's a fairly non-specific diagnosis. And many of you in the past have heard me speak before about the use of oral glucocorticoids for non-specific back pain, and saying that that's something that we, as a general rule, tend not to approve because we need a specific diagnosis with some clinical evidence around it. And you would be surprised, I hope you'd be surprised because you wouldn't do it, that we do get letters from doctors that say this person has back pain essentially because I said so, and this is a treatment, and we get very little else. So that is not enough for us to provide a TUE. And some doctors, generally not sports doctors, other specialists who don't understand the system, can get quite peeved when we say that we're not questioning your judgment, but we need to be shown how you've made that decision. Just because you said it is the case, it needs to be shown to a group of another independent group of doctors that this is the diagnosis and this is the treatment. The other thing we would consider in this is around this potential for performance enhancement. Now, this continues to be a tricky area, but WADA have put it on the list because they believe that high levels in competition have the potential for performance enhancement. So IM triamcinolone within a week of competition is going to give you high systemic levels. We would have to consider that in the scheme of things, there is a potential for performance enhancement in this scenario. And is it an indicated treatment for this condition? Well, certainly in my experience, IM triamcinolone is not the typical treatment for a generalised musculoskeletal pain, although I'm happy to learn tonight from anyone if they feel that that is a reasonable approach to this problem. So as I said, each criteria has to be met. And in fact, if we get very little medical evidence and no diagnosis, we really don't have to go any further, because if you can't meet criteria 1, there's no point even looking at criteria 2. So not surprisingly, after all of that, this TUE almost certainly would not get approved unless there was a whole lot of other information that they could provide that I haven't already shown you. So this would be a no, this one. So this is the last one, elite footballer. And I suspect this scenario is not uncommon. Pick a joint. We've picked first MTP with some degenerative OA, previously had it injected with some good response. It's documented on X-ray on numerous occasions. And this athlete is in their last season and there's 2 weeks left to the grand final. And there's a game this weekend, and the doctor with this scenario has decided that a game day injection on, let's say, the semi-final that they're assuming they're going to win, is a game day injection, so before the game starts, of local anaesthetic and glucocorticoid, and the standard mix of betamethasone. So the considerations that the doctor doing this should have are that this is truly an in-competition injection by definition. For that reason, it requires an in-advance TUE. The diagnosis, have you made a diagnosis? And so far, with the information provided, there is a diagnosis there. There looks like there's going to be an X-ray provided as the evidence for the diagnosis. So in this situation, would we grant a TUE? So firstly, the first criteria, is it a diagnosed medical condition supported by relevant clinical evidence? Well, yes, it would seem to be. The next one's a little bit more tricky. It is in competition. This is the scenario that WADA has demonstrated they have concerns about because injections on the day produce high systemic levels, regardless of the glucocorticoid that you use. And so we would have to be querying, why inject this on the day when you are going to get a high level, a high systemic level on that day? And indeed, the next scenario is this an indicated treatment? Well, glucocorticoid injections are injected into degenerative joints, and you can debate the pros and cons of that, but it is reasonably expected practice. But why on match day, when we know that the glucocorticoid action from an anti-inflammatory point of view may take a couple of days to work? The local anaesthetic component is not an issue. That doesn't come under the anti-doping. So the question we would be asking is what is the rationale for doing this on the day when it may stand to contravene or potentially contravene the issue around producing additional performance? We're not there to comment on, is this good medical practice? You know, you can argue whether injections on game day are, but that's not our role. Our role is injecting on the day will increase systemic levels to a high level that WADA have considered may give performance enhancement. I thought I'd just clarify, when we say in advance, our committee does, as many of you know, provide a phone service where you phone a friend if you want to ask about whether you can get a phone approval or provisional approval for a TUE at short notice for reassurance for both you and your athlete. And as a general rule, the ASMAC members are pretty available for this sort of thing. However, firstly, I'm not expecting a huge rash of applications because I don't believe that this happens very often, although it may. But for that reason, do not expect the ASMAC members to be sitting on their phone on Saturday morning waiting for you to ring to give them approval in advance. You may get lucky and get someone on a Saturday morning, or it is also reasonable to apply after the fact because of the short notice. There is a criteria that said that says that if it is an urgent medical scenario, that you can apply afterwards as soon as reasonable. So at the end of the day, you would put in your application and submit it to ASMAC, and we would look at it that week. We would definitely like to be getting it before the athlete has had their test. But the thing in this situation, you'd have to be pretty confident that you were going to get an approval in this scenario if you were going to rely on the retroactive component of this. So you'd need to be laying out a pretty good case that you think you could give when you do your application. So I think Larry's going to give the summary, and then we'll go to all the questions.
Yeah, a couple of great questions in the chat. So really, in summary, it's about making sure you provide the evidence that allows the TUE committee to assess your application. And when you're considering that, the steps would really be make a diagnosis, ensure that injectable glucocorticoids are indicated or recognised treatment for that particular diagnosis, and be able to justify or explain your choice of injectable glucocorticoids for administration in the washout period or in competition to a colleague or peer in the form of the TUE committee. Be cognizant that your choice of glucocorticoid will impact on the washout period, and that can actually generate quite a significant period of time if you're thinking triamcinolone, 60 days or 10 days for interarticular. And make sure you're keeping great records to protect you and the athlete, or allow you to have a stress-free application process. Just to share with you the names of the ASMAC members for those people that might not be aware. So we have Susan in Melbourne, Carolyn Broderick in Sydney, Mark Young from Brisbane, Anique Shorten in Melbourne, David Humphreys from Hobart. I'm Canberra-based, and we're all supported wonderfully by Kim Reynolds, who's our secretariat. She's here in Canberra, and Kim's details are on the bottom of the screen, but her contact details are also easily available through the web. And now we've got some questions, and
I can see the chat, Larry.
Oh, awesome.
So I can start. Matthew Slop, hello. Ontophoresis is topical, so no TUE needed for that one, which is good. Dalen, what if they have facet joint inflammation not evident on MRI? Look, I tried to give some obvious examples from one extreme to the next if you didn't work out between the first two cases. Yes, that's lovely if you see an effusion, a small effusion on a facet joint that you want to inject. It reassures you that that's where you're going. But if there's some reasonable clinical evidence in terms of clinical findings, examination findings, history, that and some changes on MR, but in all honesty, every case is going to be different. I know that, you know, we're all still practicing as well, so I think it gives us some perspective that we know that sometimes you don't see anything on scan, but clinically that's their problem. What we're looking for is that you've made a diagnosis and you have a treatment plan. What we don't want to see is they're a little bit sore everywhere, so let's just give them a big bolus dose of glucocorticoid. So no, they don't have to absolutely demonstrate joint inflammation on MR, but a reasonable clinical picture should be fine. And part of this will be feeling the way a bit. We went through this. It's essentially similar to oral glucocorticoids in many ways, and when we've had conversations about what is reasonable and what isn't. Specific diagnosis, treatment plan, some imaging, that you've tried other things, and I'm hoping this is essentially how you practice anyway, so it's not a big step outside that, but the key is going to be good notes. Because already in this scenario, and some of you may already have had, please explains, but please show us any evidence you have, because we do already now see glucocorticoid levels above the threshold from injections, and currently they're a permitted route. So I will see the positive test, and I will say to the testing group that it is possible that this above the limit glucocorticoid level is due to a permitted route injection. So we then will go back to the doctor and say, can you produce some clinical notes? And, you know, if you've got it, if it was a guide injection, some imaging or an imaging report of the injection. And that has been enough to demonstrate that it's a permitted route. We'll need more than that for a proper TUE application, but it is not dissimilar to that. As I said, as Larry said, show us your workings. What did you plan to do and why? And the reality is, if with the change in reporting levels, we're not actually expecting to see a whole lot of TUEs for this. Some people have been very anxious that, you know, there's going to be hundreds of TUEs. In fact, I don't expect to see too many at all, to tell you the truth, because the ones we'll need to see are the ones on game day. And as I said, I may be naive, but my expectation is there's not going to be many of those. And then the others are those that test positive because the injection was given in the washout, and because most Australian doctors use celestone. And if you haven't already worked out, I'd probably steer clear of triamcinolone. Most use celestone. The reporting level for celestone has doubled. It's gone from 30 to 60. And so if you use it in the washout period, you're probably still unlikely to have an athlete test positive. So for that reason, I actually don't think we're going to see many of them. Here we go. Luke, can you talk us through the practicalities of the submission process? The best way to do this, it's actually really well explained on our website. And if you get into a pickle at all, ring Kim and she helps. But basically, there is a TUE form that you download. We'd love it to be all online. It isn't yet. We're working on that you're going to be able to do it on our app. But at the moment, it is a paper process. So you download the application, you fill in the details, which is, you know, athlete name and address, your details, the diagnosis, the treatment, and you sign it. And then provide a medical letter and any imaging or extra bits and pieces that you have, and you can fax it or scan it and email it into us. If it is urgent, we can look at it fairly quickly. We have 21 days to turn these around, but we generally turn them around within a week. And if you're feeling particularly anxious, a phone call to one of us or to Kim can generally see the process hurried along, but technically we have 21 days. As I said, you can scan an email or you can fax. And maybe next year, I know Kim's working on it, that we will be able to do it all online. You won't need to download and write. What about Mark Fisher? Hi, Mark. So any sort of peritendinous injection for adhesion and scarring confirmed on imaging, yes. Any of the processes that have got some evidence and documentation in the literature that are used, yes, that would be acceptable. As I said, that the indications go together with the type of injection. The indication would need to be pretty good if you were trying to inject on the day of competition. If you're injecting 3 to 4 days out, then sort of reasonable medical practice applies. A specific diagnosis for which an injection is indicated is going to be acceptable. I'm scanning down. Epidural, perineural considered a local when it comes to washout. Do you know what? Might have to get Larry to look at the washout. Larry, are the epidural and nerve sleeve injections looking the same on the washout? The only I know it's in there, I just haven't got it in front of me. The only thing I would say, as I said, in my experience at a major games, when we actually get to see the levels that we get, those athletes that have had epidurals and facet joint injections do tend to have a longer washout. They get high levels and they get a longer washout. But as I said, if you're going to, basically at the moment, from 1st of January onwards, if you're going to inject any time around competition, you just need to make sure you keep some good medical notes. Larry's put the link in there, and they give some of the washouts. As I said, the washouts are a good indicator, but they're not absolute, because as I said, we've seen triamcinolones months out, and we've also seen a couple of betamethasone injections, one subacromial one a couple of years ago that was 6 weeks. So in individual excretion, possibly into an area where it was slowly excreted. So just because you're just outside the washout period, don't think your athlete might not test positive. And I suppose the other thing to consider is actually giving your athletes a bit of a heads up that they may, because we know athletes obviously get incredibly anxious if they get a letter from Sport Integrity Australia, as you would. But just to say that if we give you a glucocorticoid injection and you're close to competition and you're tested, you might get that letter, but I'm keeping a medical file and we can apply for a TUE if we need to. So I think some sort of reassurance, or at least some heads up that this could happen, I think is important to your athlete group, which is why there's flyers for athletes as well on the website. Ruben, does a post-game corticosteroid injection count as in-comp? No, it doesn't. I will just say on the provision, technically, the in-competition period starts at that 11:59 and finishes when doping control finishes for the day, technically. But essentially, if your athlete hasn't been nominated for doping control on that day, then competition is over. You know, I would have to say practically, if say you're in the rooms after the game and there was testers there and they've chosen to test athletes, the reality is if there's an issue with one of the athletes, you know, if they become unwell or something happens, they can roll down and select someone else. I've never seen it happen where someone's had something given to them, but it's, you know, they roll down and select them. But that's why they technically say when doping control's finished. But I also understand sometimes the testers are there for 12 hours because an athlete can't pass a sample. I think it's reasonable to say to the testers that, look, I've got an athlete that I want to give an injection to at the end of the game. Have you finished selecting your athletes? And should that scenario happen and roll down, we would certainly look at that and deal with that sensibly and appropriately. That I can tell you that would not be an issue. And if they decided to test that athlete and say technically it was in competition, if you had your notes about what had happened, we would deal with that sensibly and almost certainly provide a TUE and make that not be a problem anymore. Casey, should we be referring all injections to imaging providers? No, you don't need to. You can do them yourself, but you need to keep good notes. You need to make sure that if you are doing it in your rooms, because a lot of practices do have ultrasound machines now, if you do get the chance to, you know, take a photo and download it and put it in your notes. If not, just make sure you take good notes that we can see, and that you record, you know, the time, the site, the dose that was given. So yeah, no, you don't have to refer them off. Next one, Ross. It's out of competition. We need to apply for a TUE in advance for international. This is going to be interesting. So technically, yes.
For out of competition use?
Sorry, not for out of competition use. In competition use, no. If it's out of competition use, no. And the rule is that if it's in the washout period, to keep a medical file. That is WADA's position, and will be the only time you need to apply for a TUE is in competition. And technically, you can't apply for a TUE for a substance if it's not prohibited at the time. So glucocorticoids, although the washout periods are there to help, it doesn't mean they're prohibited then. Glucocorticoids are not prohibited out of competition. So you don't need to, and indeed technically you can't apply for a TUE out of competition for something that's not prohibited. You can only apply for TUE for something that is prohibited. So it's not prohibited out of comp. So no, you won't need to. In the past, we have, before the new rules came in, we used to give TUEs for glucocorticoids close to competition to cover washout periods, so that if you were tested in comp, or an athlete was tested in comp, the TUE covered them. But because there's a new criteria, which is 4.1E, which is you can actually officially get a TUE if you were given it out of comp and it shows up in comp. We just now rely on that. So no, you don't need to apply for TUEs out of comp here or internationally, because it isn't prohibited, is the very easy answer. The other thing I would say is, if you ever get into strife with an international TUE committee, we are always here to help negotiate. And in fact, it's in the code that the National Anti-Doping Organisation TUE committee should help facilitate. So if you have any issues dealing with an international TUE committee, we're more than happy to interpret or to negotiate or to explain with you for that. I'm glad to see Dalen's not into IM triamcinolone. For making sure I'm up to. Larry, have I missed any?
Just Tim Barber's popped one up, which is a great question.
Yeah, so in fact it says in the paper that it's for, there's two parts to this answer. The wider answer is it's the maximum, it's based on the maximum manufacturer's dose. So it depends on the manufacturer's maximum dose. Because one of the questions we've in fact asked WADA, particularly actually more around the oral, because there's so much variability in oral dosing. Some people may use 25 milligrams of pred, some 50 over shorter or longer periods of time. So I think the reality is a variability. Yes, and as I said, so long as it's good medical practice, you've documented it and you've got some good notes, whether you use 1 or 2 ampules or something, and if it shows up, then you apply for a TUE. But yes, I agree, Tim, if you're going to give 2 ampules into a facet joint, you're probably going to get a longer washout. That just means that your medical notes should be good, which, in the perfect world, they should be good all the time anyway. It is just a matter of making sure it's all documented.
David's got a great suggestion about using an additional tool to demonstrate clinical signs or efficacy, and I think that's a great adjunct to practice as well.
You would get a giraffe stamp for that, David. When we're assessing that, that would be a lovely way of proving that this was an appropriate treatment. But again, not absolutely required, but I'd be very happy with that. I feel like I've talked more than enough. As I said, this is new, but I would also say don't be overly concerned. The reporting limits have gone up for our favourite betamethasone, and as a general rule, we're not injectors on the day of competition. So I suspect we won't be seeing many of these. But if things change, or if you have concerns, we'll get back to you, or you can get back to us and ask questions. We're always available to answer questions if you're concerned. Any of the committee can do that. And certainly if we start to see a whole lot of applications that we're concerned about, we will certainly be coming out to the sportsmed group and perhaps clarifying things a bit more. But, we're not here to get you all the athletes. The TUE group are there to help you as practitioners with the choices that you make for your athletes, so that you don't end up on the wrong side of an anti-doping rule. So unless anyone's got more questions, if anyone wants to pipe up, otherwise, there you go. Larry's also put Kim's details in there, but you can also find Kim's details on the website. Thank you, Larry, for presenting all of the background. The paper is well worth a read. It's a bit of a hard read at the start, but stick with it. It is quite interesting on glucocorticoids and their use. So thank you all, and see you all soon.
We'll have this up on the website in the next week or so.
Oh, hang on. Sorry, one more question. George Pitzis has raised a ripper. Single, which is the Synvis, I think. Yeah,
HLA.
triamcinolone. Absolutely, George, because the triamcinoline's got a really long washout. So you just, as I said, document in your notes when you've done it. I understand that's actually a nice combination, and people are using it. As I said, keep good notes with good rationale, and if your athlete tests positive, then we would certainly look at that as a reasonable, a reasonable choice of treatment.
Excellent. And obviously we reach out if we can be of further assistance, and have a look on the website for all the resources that the education team have worked super hard on trying to make what's quite a technical topic, particularly for athletes, easily digestible. So hopefully some resources there for you as well.